Hey, good morning, friends. We're reading Tanglewood Tales. We are in The Dragon's Teeth, and I'm going to read the first half of the chapter today. Please bear with me. Some of these names are a little tricky. Let's get started. The Dragon's Teeth. Cadmus, Phoenix, and Cilix, the three sons of Adzener, and their little sister Europa, who was a very beautiful child, were at play together near the seashore in their father's kingdom of Phoenicia. They'd rambled to some distance from the palace where their parents dwelt, and were now in a verdant meadow, on one side of which lay the sea, all sparkling and dimpling in the sunshine, and murmuring gently against the beach. The three boys were very happy, gathering flowers and twining them into garlands with which they adorned little Europa. Seated on the grass, the child was almost hidden under the abundance of buds and blossoms, whence her rosy face peeped merrily out, and, as Cadmus said, was the prettiest of all the flowers. Just then there came a splendid butterfly fluttering along the meadow, and Cadmus, Phoenix, and Cilix set off in pursuit of it, crying out that it was a flower with wings. Europa, who was a little wearied with playing all day long, did not chase the butterfly with her brothers, but sat still where they had left her and closed her little eyes. For a while she listened to the pleasant murmur of the sea, which was like a voice saying, "Hush," and bidding her to go to sleep. But the pretty child, if she slept at all, could not have slept more than a moment when she heard something trample on the grass not far from her, and peeping out from the heaps of flowers beheld a snow-white bull. And whence could this bull have come? Europa and her brothers had been a long time playing in the meadow, and had seen no cattle nor other living thing either there or on the neighboring hills. "Brother Cadmus," cried Europa, starting up out of the midst of the roses and lilies, "Phoenix, Cilix, where are you all? Help! Help! Come and drive away this bull!" But her brothers were too far off to hear, especially as the fright took away Europa's voice and hindered her from calling very loudly. So there she stood, with her pretty mouth wide open, as pale as the other white lilies that were twisted among the other flowers in her garlands. Nevertheless, it was the suddenness with which she had perceived the bull, rather than anything frightful in his appearance, that caused Europa so much alarm. On looking at him more attentively, she began to see that he was a beautiful animal, and even fancied a particularly amiable expression in his face. As for his breath, the breath of cattle, you know, is always sweet. It was as fragrant as if he had been grazing on no other food than rosebuds, or at least the most delicate of clover blossoms. Never before did a bull have such bright and tender eyes and such smooth horns of ivory as this one. And the bull ran little races and capered sportively around the child, so that she quite forgot how big and strong he was, and from the gentleness and playfulness of his actions soon came to consider him as innocent a creature as a pet lamb. Thus frightened as she at first was, you might by and by have seen Europa stroking the bull's forehead with her small white hand, and taking the garlands off of her own head to hang them on his neck and ivory horns. Then she pulled up some blades of grass, and he ate them out of her hand, not as if he were hungry, but because he wanted to be friends with the child, and took pleasure in eating what she had touched. Well, my stars, was there ever such a gentle, sweet, pretty, and amiable creature as this bull, and ever such a nice playmate for a little girl? When the animals saw, for the bull had so much intelligence that it is really wonderful to think of, when he saw that Europa was no longer afraid of him, he grew overjoyed, and could hardly contain himself for delight. He frisked about the meadow, now here, now there, making sprightly leaps, with as little effort as a bird expends in hopping from twig to twig. Indeed, his motion was as light as if he were flying through the air, and his hoofs seemed hardly to leave their print in the grassy soil over which he trod. With the spotless hue he resembled a snowdrift, wafted along by the wind. Once he galloped so far away that Europa feared lest she might ever see him again, so setting up her childish voice called him back. "Come back, pretty creature," she cried. "Here's a nice clover blossom." And then it was delightful to witness the gratitude of this amiable bull, and how he was so full of joy and thankfulness that he capered higher than ever. He came running and bowed his head before Europa, as if he knew her to be a king's daughter, or else recognized the important truth that a little girl is everybody's queen. And not only did the bull bend his neck, he absolutely knelt down at her feet and made such intelligent nods and other inviting gestures that Europa understood what he meant just as well as if he had put it in so many words. "Come, dear child," was what he wanted to say. "Let me give you a ride on my back." At the first thought of such a thing, Europa drew back, but then she considered in her wise little head that there could be no possible harm in taking just one gallop on the back of this docile and friendly animal, who would certainly set her down the very instant she desired. And how it would surprise her brothers to see her riding across the green meadow, and what merry times they might have, either taking turns for a gallop or clambering on the gentle creature, all four children together, and careening round the field with shouts of laughter, would be heard as far off as King Adzener's palace. To think, "Oh, I think I will do it," said the child to herself, and indeed, why not? She cast a glance around and caught a glimpse of Cadmus, Phoenix, and Cilix, who were still in pursuit of the butterfly, almost at the other end of the meadow. It would be the quickest way of rejoining them to get upon the white bull's back. She came a step nearer to him, therefore, and, sociable creature that he was, he showed so much joy at this mark of her confidence that the child could not find in her heart to hesitate any longer. Making one bound, for this little princess was as active as a squirrel, there sat Europa on the beautiful bull, holding an ivory horn in each hand, lest she should fall off. "Softly, pretty bull, softly," she said, rather frightened at what she had done. "Do not gallop too fast." Having got the child on his back, the animal gave a leap into the air and came down so like a feather that Europa did not know when his hooves had touched the ground. Then he began a race to the part of the flowery plain where her three brothers were, and where they had just caught their splendid butterfly. Europa screamed with delight, and Phoenix, Cilix, and Cadmus stood gaping at the spectacle of their sister mounted on a white bull, not knowing whether to be frightened or to wish the same good luck for themselves. The gentle and innocent creature, for who could possibly doubt that he was so, pranced round among the children as sportively as a kitten. Europa all the while looked down upon her brothers, nodding and laughing, but yet with a sort of stateliness in her rosy little face. As the bull wheeled about to take another gallop across the meadow, the child waved her hand and said, "Goodbye," playfully pretending that she was now bound on a distant journey and might not see her brothers again for nobody could tell how long. "Goodbye," shouted Cadmus, Phoenix, and Cilix, all in one breath. But together, with her enjoyment of the sport, there was still a little remnant of fear in the child's heart, so that her last look at the three boys was a troubled one, and made them feel as if their dear sister were really leaving them forever. And what do you think the snowy bull did next? Why, he set off as swift as the wind, straight down to the seashore, scampered across the sand, took an airy leap, and plunged right in among the foaming billows. The white spray rose in a shower over him and little Europa and fell splattering down upon the water. What a scream of terror did the poor child send forth! The three brothers screamed manfully likewise and ran to the shore as fast as their legs would carry them, with Cadmus at their head. But it was too late. When they reached the margin of the sand, the treacherous animal was already far away in the wide blue sea, and with only his snowy head and tail emerging, the poor little Europa between them, stretching out one hand toward her dear brothers, while she grasped the bull's ivory horn with the other. And there stood Cadmus, Phoenix, and Cilix, gazing at this sad spectacle through their tears until they could no longer distinguish the bull's snowy head from the white-capped billows that seemed to boil up out of the sea's depths around them. Nothing was ever seen of the white bull, nothing more of the beautiful child. This was a mournful story, as you may well think, for the three boys to carry home to their parents. King Adzener and their father was the ruler of the whole country, but he loved his little daughter Europa better than his kingdom, or than all of his other children, or than anything else in the world. Therefore, when Cadmus and his 2 brothers came crying home and told him how a white bull had carried off their sister and swam with her over the sea, the king was quite beside himself with grief and rage. Although it was now twilight and fast growing dark, he bade them set out instantly in search of her. "Never shall you see my face again," he cried, "unless you bring me back my little Europa, to gladden me with her smiles and her pretty ways. Be gone, and enter my presence no more till you come leading her by the hand." As King Adziner said this, his eyes flashed fire, for he was a very passionate king, and he looked so terribly angry that the poor boys did not even venture to ask for their suppers, but slunk away out of the palace, and only paused on the steps a moment to consult whither they should go first. While they were standing there all in dismay, their mother, Queen Telephassa, who happened not to be by when they told the story to the king, came hurrying after them and said that she too would go in quest of her daughter. "Oh, no, mother," cried the boys. "The night is dark, and there is no knowing what troubles and perils we may meet with." "Alas, my dear children," answered poor Queen Telephassa, weeping bitterly, "that is only another reason why I should go with you. If I should lose you too, as well as my little Europa, what would become of me?" "And let me go likewise," said their playfellow Thasus, who came running to join them. Thasus was the son of a seafaring person in the neighborhood. He had been brought up with the young princes and was their intimate friend, and loved Europa very much, so they consented that he should accompany them. The whole party therefore set forth together. Cadmus, Phoenix, Cilix, and Thasus clustered round Queen Telephassa, grasping her skirts and begging her to lean upon their shoulders whenever she felt weary. In this manner they went down the palace steps and began a journey which turned out to be a great deal longer than they had dreamed of. The last that they saw of King Adziner, he came to the door with a servant holding a torch beside him and called after them into the gathering of darkness, "Remember, never ascend these steps again without the child." "Never?" sobbed Queen Telephassa, and the 3 brothers and Thasus answered, "Never, never, never, never." And they kept their word. Year after year, King Adziner sat in the solitude of his beautiful palace, listening in vain for their returning footsteps, hoping to hear the familiar voice of the queen and the cheerful talk of his sons and their playfellow Thasus entering the door together, and the sweet, childish accents of little Europa in the midst of them. But so long a time went by that at last, if they had really come, the king would not have known that this was the voice of Telephassa, and these the younger voices that used to make such joyful echoes when the children were playing about the palace. We must now leave King Adziner to sit on his throne, and must go along with Queen Telephassa and her 4 youthful companions. They went on, and traveled a long way, and paused over mountains and rivers, and sailed over seas. Here and there and everywhere they made continual inquiry if any person could tell them what had become of Europa. The rustic people of whom they asked this question paused a little while for their labors in the field, and looked very much surprised. They thought it strange to behold a woman in the garb of a queen, for Telephassa in her haste had forgotten to take off her crown and her royal robes. Roaming about the country with 4 lads around her, on such an errand as this seemed to be. But nobody could give them any tidings of Europa. Nobody had seen the little girl dressed like a princess and mounted on a snow-white bull, which galloped as swiftly as the wind. I cannot tell you how long Queen Telephassa and Cadmus and Phoenix and Cilix, her 3 sons, and Thasus, their playfellow, went wandering along the highways and bypaths, or through the pathless wilderness of the earth in this manner. But certain it is that before they reached any place for rest, their splendid garments were quite worn out. They all looked very much travel-stained, and would have had the dust of many countries on their shoes, if the streams through which they waded had not washed it all away. When they had been gone a year, Telephassa threw away her crown, because it chafed her forehead. It has given me many a headache," said the poor queen, "and it cannot cure my heartache." As fast as their princely robes got torn and tattered, they exchanged them for such mean attire as ordinary people wore. By and by, they came to have a wild and homeless aspect, so that you would much sooner have taken them for a gypsy family than a queen and 3 princes and a young nobleman who had once a palace for a home and a train of servants to do their bidding. The 4 boys grew up to be tall young men with sunburnt faces, each of them girded on a sword, to defend themselves against the perils of the way. When the husbandmen at whose farmhouses they sought hospitality needed their assistance in the harvest field, they gave it willingly, and Queen Telephassa, who had done no work in her palace save to braid silk threads with golden ones, came behind them to bind the sheaves. If payment was offered, they shook their heads and only asked for tidings of Europa. "There are bulls enough in my pasture," the old farmers would reply, "but I never heard of one like this you tell me of. A snow-white bull with a little princess on his back? Ho, ho, I ask your pardon, good folks, but there never was such a sight seen hereabouts." At last, when his upper lip began to have the down on it, Phoenix grew weary, and rambling hither and thither to no purpose. So one day, when they happened to be passing through a pleasant and solitary tract of country, he sat himself down on a heap of moss. "I can go no farther," said Phoenix. "It is a mere foolish waste of life, to spend it as we do, always wandering up and down and never coming to any home at nightfall. Our sister is lost and never will be found. She probably perished in the sea, or to whatever shore the white bull may have carried her. It is now so many years ago that there would be neither love nor acquaintance between us should we meet again. My father has forbidden us to return to his palace, so I shall build me a hut of branches and dwell there." "Well, son Phoenix," said Telephassa sorrowfully, "you have grown to be a man, and must do as you judge best. But for my part, I will still go in quest of my poor child." "And we 3 will go along with you," cried Cadmus and Cilix and their faithful friend Theseus. But before setting out, they all helped Phoenix to build a habitation. When completed, it was a sweet rural bower roofed overhead with an arch of living boughs. Inside there were 2 pleasant rooms, one of which had a soft heap of moss for a bed, while the other was furnished with a rustic seat or 2 curiously fashioned out of the crooked roots of trees. So comfortable and homelike did it seem that Telephassa and her 3 companions could not help sighing to think that they must still roam about the world, instead of spending the remainder of their lives in some cheerful abode as they had here built for Phoenix. But when they bade him farewell, Phoenix shed tears, and probably regretted that he was no longer to keep them company. However, he had fixed upon an admirable place to dwell in, and by there came other people who chanced to have no homes, and seeing how pleasant a spot it was, they built themselves huts in the neighborhood of Phoenix's habitation. Thus, before many years went by, a city had grown up there, in the center of which was seen a stately palace of marble, wherein dwelt Phoenix, clothed in a purple robe and wearing a golden crown upon his head. For the inhabitants of the new city, finding that he had royal blood in his veins, had chosen him to be their king. The very first decree of state which King Phoenix issued was that if a maiden happened to arrive in the kingdom mounted on a snow-white bull and calling herself Europa, his subjects should treat her with the greatest kindness and respect and immediately bring her to his palace. You may see by this that Phoenix's conscience never quite ceased to trouble him, for giving up the quest of his dear sister and sitting himself down to be comfortable while his mother and her companions went onward. But often and often, as the close of a weary day's journey, did Telephassa and Cadmus, Cilix, and Theseus remember the pleasant spot in which they had left Phoenix. It was a sorrowful prospect for these wanderers that on the morrow they must again set forth, and that, after many nightfalls, they would perhaps be no nearer the close of their toilsome pilgrimage than now. These thoughts made them all melancholy at times, but appeared to torment Cilix more than the rest of the party. At length one morning, when they were taking their staffs in hand to set out, he thus addressed them. "My dear mother, and you, good brother Cadmus, and my friend Theseus, methinks we are like people in a dream. There is no substance in the life which we are leading. It is a dreary length of time since the white bull carried off my sister Europa that I have quite forgotten how she looked, and the tones of her voice, and indeed almost doubt whether such a little girl ever lived in the world. And whether she once lived or no, I am convinced that she no longer survives, and that therefore it is the merest folly to waste our own lives and happiness in seeking her. Were we to find her, she would now be a woman grown, and would look upon us all as strangers. So to tell you the truth, I have resolved to take up my abode here, and I entreat you, mother, brother, and friend, to follow my example." "Not I, for one," said Telephassa, although the poor queen, firmly as she spoke, was so travel-worn that she could hardly put her foot to the ground. "Not I, for one. In the depths of my heart, little Europa is still the rosy child who ran to gather flowers so many years ago. She has not grown to womanhood, nor forgotten me. At noon, at night, journeying onward, sitting down to rest, her childish voice is always in my ears calling, 'Mother, mother.' Stop here who may. There is no repose for me." "Nor for me," said Cadmus, "while my dear mother pleases to go onward." And the faithful Theseus, too, had resolved to bear them company. They remained with Cilix a few days, however, and helped him to build a rustic bower resembling the one which they had formerly built for Phoenix. When they were bidding him farewell, Cilix burst into tears and told his mother that it seemed just as melancholy a dream to stay there, in solitude, as to go onward. If she really believed that they would ever find Europa, he was willing to continue the search with them even now. But Telephassa bade him to remain there and be happy, if his own heart would let him. So the pilgrims took their leave of him and departed, and were hardly out of sight before some other wandering people came along that way, and saw Cilix's habitation, and were greatly delighted with the appearance of the place. There being abundance of unoccupied ground in the neighborhood, these strangers built huts for themselves, and were soon joined by a multitude of new settlers, who quickly formed a city. In the middle of it was seen a magnificent palace of colored marble, on the balcony of which every noontide appeared Cilix, in a long purple robe, with a jeweled crown upon his head. For the inhabitants, when they found out that he was a king's son, had considered him the fittest of all men to be a king himself. One of the first acts of King Cilix's government was to send out an expedition consisting of a grave ambassador and an escort of bold and hardy young men, with orders to visit the principal kingdoms of the earth, and inquire whether a young maiden had passed through these regions galloping swiftly on a white bull. It is therefore plain to my mind that Cilix secretly blamed himself for giving up the search for Europa as long as he was able to put one foot before the other. As for Telephassa and Cadmus and the good Theseus, it grieves me to think of them. And keeping up that weary pilgrimage, the two young men did their best for the poor queen, helping her over the rough places, often carrying her across rivulets in their faithful arms, and seeking to shelter her at nightfall, even when they themselves lay on the ground sad. Sad it was to hear them asking of every passer-by if he had seen Europa, so long after the white bull had carried her away. But though the gray years thrust themselves between, and made the child's figure dim in their remembrance, neither of these true-hearted three ever dreamed of giving up the search. One morning, however, poor Theseus found that he had sprained his ankle, and could not possibly go a step farther. "After a few days, to be sure," said he mournfully, "I might make shift to hobble along with a stick, but that would only delay you, and perhaps hinder you from finding dear little Europa after all your pains and trouble. Do you go forward, therefore, my beloved companions, and leave me to follow as I may." "Thou hast been a true friend, dear Theseus," said Queen Telephassa, kissing his forehead. "Being neither my son nor the brother of our lost Europa, thou hast shown thyself truer to me than Phoenix and Cilix did, whom we have left behind us. Without thy loving help, and that of my son Cadmus, my limbs would not have borne me half so far as this. Now take thy rest, and be at peace. And it is the first time I have owned it to myself, I begin to question whether we shall ever find my beloved daughter in this world." Saying this, the poor queen shed tears, because it was a grievous trial to the mother's heart to confess that her hopes were growing faint. From that day forward, Cadmus noticed that she never traveled with the same alacrity of spirit than that had heretofore supported her. Her weight was heavier upon his arm. Before setting out, Cadmus helped Theseus build a bower, while Telephassa, being too infirm to give any great assistance, advised them how to fit it up and furnish it, so that it might be as comfortable as a hut of branches could. Theseus, however, did not spend all his days in this green bower, for it happened to him, as to Phoenix and Cilix, that other homeless people visited the spot, and liked it, and built themselves habitations in the neighborhood. So here, in the course of a few years, was another thriving city, with a red freestone palace in the center of it, where Theseus sat upon a throne, doing justice to the people, with a purple robe over his shoulders, a scepter in his hand, and a crown upon his head. The inhabitants had made him king, not for the sake of any royal blood, for none was in his veins, but because Theseus was an upright, true-hearted, and courageous man, and therefore fit to rule. But when the affairs of his kingdom were all settled, King Theseus laid aside his purple robe and crown and scepter, and bade his worthiest subjects distribute justice to the people in his stead. Then, grasping the pilgrim's staff that had supported him so long, he set forth again, hoping still to discover some hoof mark of the snow-white bull, some trace of the vanished child. He returned after a lengthened absence and sat down wearily upon his throne. To his latest hour, nevertheless, King Theseus showed his true-hearted remembrance of Europa by ordering that a fire should always be kept burning in his palace, and a bath steaming hot, and food ready to be served up, and a bed with snow-white sheets in case the maiden should arrive and require immediate refreshment. And though Europa never came, the good Theseus had the blessings of many a poor traveler who profited by the food and lodging which were meant for the little playmate of the king's boyhood. Telephassa and Cadmus were now pursuing their weary way, with no companion but each other. The queen leaned heavily upon her son's arm, and could walk only a few miles a day. But for all her weakness and weariness, she would not be persuaded to give up the search. It was enough to bring tears into the eyes of the bearded men to hear the melancholy tone with which she inquired of every stranger whether he could tell her any news of the lost child. "Have you seen a little girl?" "No, no. I mean a young maiden of full growth, passing by this way, mounted on a snow-white bull which gallops as swiftly as the wind?" "We have seen no such wondrous sight," the people would reply, and very often, taking Cadmus aside, they whispered to him, "Is this stately and sad-looking woman your mother? Surely she is not in her right mind, and you ought to take her home and make her comfortable, and do your best to get this dream out of her fancy." "It is no dream," said Cadmus. "Everything else is a dream, save that." But one day Telephassa seemed feebler than usual, and leaned almost her whole weight on the arm of Cadmus, and walked more slowly than ever before. At last they reached a solitary spot, where she told her son that she must needs lie down and take a good long rest. "A good long rest," she repeated, looking Cadmus tenderly in the face. "A good long rest, thou dearest one." "As long as you please, dear mother," answered Cadmus. Telephassa bade him sit down on the turf beside her, and then she took his hand. "My son," said she, fixing her dim eyes most lovingly upon him, "this rest that I speak of will be very long indeed. You must not wait till it is finished. Dear Cadmus, you do not comprehend me. You must make a grave here and lay your mother's weary frame into it. My pilgrimage is over." Cadmus burst into tears, and for a long time refused to believe that his dear mother was now to be taken from him. But Telephassa reasoned with him and kissed him, and at length made him discern that it was better for her spirit to pass away out of the toil and weariness and grief and disappointment which had burdened her on earth ever since the child was lost. He therefore repressed his sorrow and listened to her last words. "Dear Cadmus," said she, Thou hast been the truest son that ever mother had, and faithful to the very last. Who else would have borne with me my infirmities as thou hast? It is owing to thy care, thou tenderest child, that my grave was not dug long years ago, or in some valley, or in some hillside that lies far behind us. It is enough, thou shalt wander no more on this hopeless search, but when thou hast laid thy mother in the earth, then go, my son, to Delphi, and inquire of the oracle what thou shalt do next. "Oh, mother, mother," cried Cadmus, "couldst thou have seen my sister before this hour?" "It matters little now," answered Telephassa, and there was a smile upon her face. "I go now to the better world, and sooner or later shall find my daughter there. I will not sadden you, my little hearers, with telling how Telephassa died and was buried, but will only say that her dying smile grew brighter instead of vanishing from her dead face, so that Cadmus left convinced that at her very first step into the better world, had she caught Europa in her arms, he planted some flowers on his mother's grave and let them grow there, and made the place beautiful when he should be far away. After performing this last sorrowful duty, he set forth alone and took the road toward the famous oracle of Delphi, as Telephassa had advised him. On his way thither, he still inquired of most people whom he met whether they had seen Europa, for to say the truth, Cadmus had grown so accustomed to ask the question that it came to his lips as readily as a remark about the weather. He received various answers. Some told him one thing and some another. Among the rest, a mariner affirmed that many years before, in a distant country, he had heard a rumor about a white bull which came swimming across the sea with a child on his back, dressed up in flowers that were blighted by the sea water. He did not know what had become of the child or the bull, and Cadmus suspected indeed by a queer twinkle in the mariner's eyes that he was putting a joke upon him, and had never really heard anything about the matter. Poor Cadmus found it more wearisome to travel alone than to bear all his dear mother's weight, while she had kept him company. His heart, you will understand, was now so heavy that it seemed impossible sometimes to carry it any farther. But his limbs were strong and active, and well accustomed to exercise. He walked swiftly along, thinking of King Adziner and Queen Telephassa and his brothers and the friendly Theseus, all of whom he had left behind him at one point of his pilgrimage or another, and never expected to see them any more. Full of these remembrances, he came within sight of a lofty mountain, within which the people thereabouts told him was called Parnassus. On the slope of Mount Parnassus was the famous Delphi, whither Cadmus was going. This Delphi was supposed to be the very midmost spot of the whole world. The place of the oracle was a certain cavity on the mountainside, over which, when Cadmus came thither, he found a rude bower of branches. It reminded him of those which he had helped to build for Phoenix and Cilix, and afterward for Theseus. In later times, when multitudes of people came from great distances to put questions to the oracle, a spacious temple of marble was erected over the spot. But in the days of Cadmus, as I have told you, there was only this rustic bower, with its abundance of green foliage, and a tuft of shrubbery that ran wild over the mysterious hole in the hillside. When Cadmus had thrust a passage through the tangled boughs, he made his way into the bower. He did not at first discern the half-hidden cavity, but soon he felt a cold stream of air rushing out of it, with so much force that it shook the ringlets on his cheek. Pulling away the shrubbery which clustered over the hole, he bent forward and spoke in a distant but reverential tone, as if addressing some unseen personage inside the mountain. "Sacred oracle of Delphi," said he, "whither shall I go next in quest of my dear sister Europa?" There was at first a deep silence, then a rushing sound or a noise like a long sigh proceeding out of the interior of the earth. This cavity, you must know, was looked upon as a sort of fountain of truth, which sometimes gushed out in audible words, although, for the most part, these words were such a riddle that they might just as well have stayed at the bottom of the hole. But Cadmus was more fortunate than many others who went to Delphi in search of truth. By and by, the rushing noise began to sound like articulate language. It repeated over and over again, the following sentence, which after all was so like the vague whistle of a blast of air that Cadmus really did not quite know whether it meant anything or not. Seek her no more. Seek her no more. Seek her no more. What then shall I do? Asked Cadmus. For ever since he was a child, you know, it had been the great object of his life to find his sister. From the very hour that he left following the butterfly in the meadow near his father's palace, he had done his best to follow Europa over land and sea, and now if he must give up the search, he seemed to have no more business in the world. But again, the sighing gust of air grew into something like a hoarse voice. Follow the cow, it said. Follow the cow. Follow the cow. And when these words had been repeated until Cadmus was quite tired of hearing them, especially as he could not imagine what cow it was or why he was to follow her, the gusty hole gave vent to another sentence. Where the stray cow lies, there is your home. These words were pronounced but a single time and died away into a whisper before Cadmus was fully satisfied that he had caught the meaning. He put other questions, but received no answer. Only the gust of wind sighed continually out of the cavity and blew the withered leaves rustling along the ground before it. We'll stop there and start back next time.